Well, welcome to our conversation about Brian McLaren's chapter 22 about Jesus the Teacher. We had a chance to hear some preaching about it this morning. I'm Reverend Lance here at First Congregational United Church of Christ of Alpena. And with us we have two guest conversation partners, all of whom were present today and members of our church. First on the far distance here is Lee Copeland. Lee has a background of having played music behind Dr. Gene Scott, a very well-known California preacher, television person, has a long history of a lot of interesting reading, and we look forward to having conversation with Lee Copeland. And in the middle here, Gene Bacon is a retired United Methodist minister here in Alpena and had a full career. He's now active with our congregation. We're grateful to have Gene bring a perspective as well. So that's who's here. Our topic is Jesus the Teacher, and this morning, if we read chapter 22 or you heard the sermon, we've had a conversation about it. Was there anything in particular in this chapter or the comments about Jesus the Teacher that particularly struck you? And I'll start with you, Lee. Was there anything that struck you in today's presentation?
How many? 6 of those different methods of presenting, was it 6 or 7? All of those bring out the beginning question is like these people, and you brought up that they weren't going to be listening with a lot of centuries-old dogmatics about ideas of the end of the world or what happens to you after you die and God's judgment. What we saw work, if he talked in these different venues or different situations and people responded, it must be, in my reading of it, that he was addressing things and they were all of their enthusiasm and their response to it indicates that he was telling them things that they already knew. And he was reminding them of things, and that this was not some kind of voice from heaven telling them stuff that was like going to totally upset everything about them. He was reminding them and touching things that they already knew, and that's why each one of these situations work. That's what struck me.
And thank you for bringing that up. I meant to say at the beginning that there's 3 parts to today's presentation. One of them was about the 6 different ways Jesus was an active teacher, and great examples of it there. And thank you for raising that up. The second part went into what was he teaching about? The kingdom of God, right. And how do we understand that, which is another topic. And then the third part of it ended up with him challenging us with how would we in today's world talk about the issues and dynamics that were brought up in those ways. So that was really 6 ways.
When you say he, you were talking about, at that point you were talking about Brian, right? Or well, was it Jesus who challenged us?
Brian McLaren pointed out the 6 different ways that Jesus did the challenging.
Right.
Brian McLaren raised a whole lot of ways we could think of the kingdom of God in today's world, and then challenged us to think, how would we do it ourselves? So I meant to say that at the very beginning, so thanks for reminding me. So there you go, 6 ways, and that they were real. They were actually in their world, real stuff that he was dealing with. It wasn't some abstraction, it wasn't some theological thing, it was real world realities.
Can I give you one example?
Yeah, please.
He goes, when he started healing things, number 1, with the signs and wonders, and one of the examples is, it dramatizes God's desire to heal our distorted vision of life. That's what human beings are. We want to solve that problem. This wasn't something that only God feels. He was plugging into the very essence of what we want and what our life means and what we care about. That feeling, and you can call it the divinity in me or what, doesn't matter, but he's pointing to what we want. And he brought that out.
And clarifying our vision. And I appreciated that in the one about blindness in particular. It's not the blind guy who's healed is the end of the story. It's an example and a teaching that we're trying to clear our visions and open our blindnesses as well. So I could take that story as part of mine, not just about that person who got healed.
And by the way, you can let me say one more thing. You go through each one of these different ways of doing it. For example, the next one is big crowds. Again, that indicates if he has the ability to get a whole bunch of people to sit down and listen and to respond, it must be because he's touched something that is there and is
already there. Yeah, very much. You wanted to say something there?
I was going to say that when we think of Jesus as the teacher, we normally think of him, you know, during the Sermon on the Mount, or sitting in a fishing boat, instructing the crowds gathered on the beach, and so on. But what I found interesting in this chapter was that he also talks about, Brian McLaren talks about Jesus as teaching through some of his miracles and through his prophetic actions, like when he cleansed the temple, for instance. He is teaching the people, you know, we've gotten off the track here. We're turning this temple into a big shopping mall, and it's supposed to be a house of prayer. And so he does this dramatic act, but it's a teaching act. And so it was good to see that Jesus could be teaching when we wouldn't normally think of him as being a teacher, but in other kinds of ways.
And I'll say the one thing, and that particular thing struck me the most, was when he used the crucifixion, which is so profound in most Christian traditions, is the blood, the sacrifice, death, resurrection, all that. And he said that was his greatest teaching, because as he's put on that cross, he's pointing out the difference between the kingdom of Rome and its violence and its power and everything, and the kingdom of God, which submits to it or doesn't fight back. That his forgiving the people that put him there is a huge teaching. It's not just his crucifixion.
But to kind of come from where I was coming from, the reason these messages worked, and I'll do that one too. The reason that got the response is that people identified, yes, this is what my life is like. It's suffering, and I'm going to die, and it wasn't just a demonstration how evil these Romans are. It was an embodiment and an identification with, this is what life is like, and this is how I feel.
And Jesus was fully involved in that, 100%.
It wasn't merely a rebuke of the Romans. It was an identification with everyone who saw that. Look, I know what this human existence is full of.
And in their suffering, they are accompanied by somebody who did it also.
Right. I prefer that identification thing rather than, I'm going to show you how evil the Romans are.
Thank you. Well, and now I'm going to move to you. In the process of the sermon or the chapter, was there anything in particular that struck you?
Well, I was struck by the different ways that Brian McLaren talks about the kingdom of God, the different terms that he used. You mentioned it in your sermon, and you felt you didn't relate to it that well, but I thought some of these ideas were very helpful by presenting a whole series of different ways of saying the kingdom of God. Then you get an idea that there are different aspects to these things, like, for instance, God's holy ecosystem. I've always been a big Earth Day person, and this idea of suggesting a dynamic connectedness between and amongst us was a powerful idea for me, but that's all part of the kingdom, God's kingdom.
I like that.
Matthew Fox talks about the kingdom of God as the kingdom of God, K-I-N.
K-I-N.
And, you know,
the
it's
relational
like
stuff.
Kinship, you know. So I
really
like some of those.
Give us another of those in there, because that's...
God's beloved community, God's regenerative economy.
That's the one I like.
Regenerative,
Yeah.
okay. And
Well, actually, economy. Now, I'm going to connect that to the whole critique of hierarchy. I think hierarchies are necessary and a part of aliveness, but go ahead.
I forgot what I was saying now. Yeah, the regenerative economy, that's powerful too, because we're caught up in, well, we're part of a capitalist society, so we're caught up in
competitive,
you know, and greed in a sense. It's, you know, we believe that it's
consumerism.
Consumerism, and it's all about me. It's beating the other guy, always being right, being one step ahead of the game, you know, and Jesus is talking about a whole different an economy of grace, really, that where people share what they have and care about each other, and it's a very different kind of economy than just every man for himself and fight to get on top and that kind of thing. And so he's kind of turning the world upside down in his normal philosophy, and it's a very
it's challenging. It's challenging for us, and it could disturb the way we do economy if we actually began to do that.
Yeah, this is one of the things I have the strongest reaction to, because I would want to present a very positive and alive and economically beautiful and challenging and human picture of what hierarchy is. It's not necessarily and inherently this kind of the greediness and the top-down and the control by power. I would like to remind us that hierarchies are more essentially hierarchies of competence, of people who are doing things well and get most of the rewards because they're doing well, and we all benefit from that. And we need to not have a kind of programmatic ideological rejection of hierarchy per se. And that's, I will want to, you know, keep that before us. Because, for example, if we go, you know, remember where I said how we end. If we want to be a teacher and we want to go into this community, we can't go, every time there's any kind of organisms or people getting together to do something, there's going to be a hierarchy that's necessary for that accomplishment and all of those good things. If we go into this community and address the pathological parts of hierarchies, we need to be able to say and identify and talk about the goodness of those hierarchical structures of competence and achievement and people wanting to do the best they can and that kind of, we need to, because if we simply enter all of these hierarchies with this message of grace and forgiveness, and we always present this kind of oversimplified business of hierarchies are bad, we're not going to have an audience.
I think something comes to my mind as you say that is someone like Bill Gates and Bill and Melinda Gates. They gained their financial wherewithal by being exceptionally competent in the field that they were innovating, and their entrepreneurship and the way that they arranged the Microsoft businesses, and now in there with billions of dollars, they're also dedicating themselves to world health issues, eliminating diseases, feeding programs, all kinds of benevolent philanthropic things. So there you have a picture of someone who, in effect, in the old Horatio Alger days, strive and succeed, you too can succeed, has succeeded and still kept the humanity and the care of others and that desire. So you're right, one size fits all doesn't work.
We need to be able to celebrate competence, hierarchy, and achievement in the whole business about wanting to be the best, and that's good.
But also another picture would be the Sam Walton family chain. When Sam Walton was creating the Walmart, he was things like buy American, only buy American. He wouldn't buy foreign things. And he created his system of retail outlets in wholesale kind of prices. Well, the next generation took over. They inherited all that money, and they're doing what they want with it, and they changed the value system that was originally there to where now the low prices were coming from China or from Singapore or some places. So they forced Stanley tools and Rubbermaid and stuff out of America and into international places. And now we're saying, well, yeah, that gave us a 50-cent cheaper rubber bin, but we lost the whole community of factories that used to be making them here. So one generation that creates that hierarchy, that has the vision, that articulates something, is then inherited by their heirs, who have a totally, they just felt that money was theirs because their pappy raised it for them. And the second generation often doesn't have the entrepreneurial desire that the first one did. The vision is gone.
For competence.
But what happens with a hierarchy, especially a moneyed hierarchy, the inheritor has all the power, is the chair of the board, even though they may not have the vision or the ability. So part of it may be that the hierarchy continues generation after generation, the money continues in the pockets of the same families, and the vision that we would have celebrated in the Horatio Alger days where it got started has turned into a oligarchy.
Well, we have to celebrate it in order if we come in with the antidote and the corrective steps, you know, yes, hierarchies tend to that kind of depravity and breakdown. But if we go in with just that, we won't have an audience. I mean, I'll go as far as to say the Pax Romana and in the Jewish system, if I was going to, if those were things that I wanted to approach today, I wouldn't go in, I would go in and celebrate their achievements, their competence, their brilliance, their intelligence, the peace of the world, the roads, the thing that the gospel spread on, and that, you know, I mean, it isn't an inherently top-down evil thing. It's hierarchies tend to become that, but our job and what I think Jesus did was to correct, the bad parts.
Correct where the errors are and not dismantle the entire institution. Just correct the errors, the human errors and the institutional errors.
Yeah,
Sounds fair.
Well, look, here's a hierarchical thing with the Romans. That Roman soldier says, Jesus, I have these people working under me. I can tell this one to go and this one to go. Jesus liked that. That's, maybe I'm taking that too far, but there can be, and I'll look for others where he sensed that he didn't condemn the very business of rulership and hierarchy. Anyway, I made my point there.
Good, thank you. A different direction to go is just a similar kind of question though. Was there anything in particular that encouraged you and inspired you? So we've been talking about the things where we found disagreements and where we found some real challenging images. But was there anything in this about Jesus being the teacher that inspired you? Either one of you.
Well, I kind of liked his McLaren's talking about the kingdom of God in terms that are used in the Gospel of John. Life, life of the age, a life to the full. I came that you might have life in all its fullness.
Abundant life.
It's a good way to kind of break down that phrase, the kingdom of God, because it can be kind of vague to most people. And when you think of kingdom, you think of kings and
royalty,
and gold and all that.
Property.
You don't think of what I think Jesus was getting at. And I guess if I were to put it in my own terms, it goes back to the Lord's Prayer when Jesus says, "Thy kingdom come," or in other words, "Thy will be done on earth." So for me, the kingdom of God comes to us when we are engaged in doing the will of God, when we walk in the way and the will of God. And when God's will, in a sense, becomes our will, and then we're at peace and we're reconciled and reaching out to others and so on. So I like that.
And as he says toward the end there, that if we seek that kingdom of God in whatever we name it, life, abundant life, ecosystem, regenerative economy, cooperative, commonwealth, however we want to name it, if we're seeking that where we are doing God's will to the flourishing of not only ourselves, but our society around us, then we will find all the other stuff falls naturally into place. You don't have to pursue a lot of different agenda. If you pursue first doing God's will, on a real basis, daily basis, in your relationships, in your relation to the world. I think you've got it. That's very inspiring.
I'm inspired by what I was saying, that a teacher, me, when I approach somebody and I have some insight about what could make things better or whatever, if I remind myself that they already know this, and there's things that I can learn from them, and I need not come at them with an idea of I'm going to turn on some light that you've never seen before. My role is to have that respect and humility to understand that people know this, and we can work together to remind ourselves. But good teaching reminds people of things that we already knew. That's inspiring.
It is. And that segues nicely into the last thing. We only have a half hour together here. Yeah. So what makes for a good teacher? You're just bringing that up.
That's what I'm getting.
And can you think of anyone in your life who has played that role, a teacher that is memorable to you because of something? And then what was it? What was that thing that made the good teacher?
I can definitely think of someone in my life. I had a high school English teacher, I think it was a sophomore, named Mr. DQ, and he was the best teacher I've ever had. I mean, this guy was really good. He was, he just taught with a natural kind of way, and if there were some kids in the class that would make a wisecrack, he would sort of out-wisecrack their wisecrack, hit up a comeback that was even better than what they said, and so he kind of silenced the critics, so to speak, just by being so clever in his responses. But he actually made us work a lot. But the kid, we wrote a lot of papers in his class, but people wanted to take his class anyway, because he made us. He did this whole series of things about what it means to be a human being, and we started out very basically talking about us as being sensory creatures in a sense. And so he'd say, I want you to go home tonight, sit out on the front porch for 15 minutes and listen, and then write a paper about what you heard. Or go home and eat an apple and then describe what eating of the apple is like. So we started out with those kind of basic sensory things, but by the end of the year we were writing papers on, what is happiness and what is community and what is truth and beauty, and we sort of had the whole picture of humanity that came about in that class. So he was just excellent. He was just a good teacher, and you could tell that he seemed to love the students. He just you could just tell that he cared about you. He was just great.
I think those
Master teacher.
some key things. They knew that they were known and they were loved. They were known by name and that they cared about. That he was having you do sensory basic stuff, which most of the time we do it all. We eat apples all the time. We sit out on the porch and listen to crickets and look at the stars. But to say, now describe that. What did you feel? What did you see? How did it? That causes you to pay attention to all those extra things. And if you do that in high school already, you've got a lifetime ahead of you of paying attention to that. It also makes me wonder how it would do in a teach to the test kind of system that we have now. Because explaining how to eat an apple doesn't necessarily connect to the science, technology, engineering thing that we're measuring anymore. But it's a wonderful picture.
He was trying to get at the whole idea of what it means, what it is to be a human being.
To be human.
What is it? What is humanity? And I think Jesus is kind of at the same thing too. What does it mean to be a full human being? I came that you might have life in all its fullness, and he wants us to have that. And his parables kind of challenge us to think about life in a new way.
And the parables that were assigned as the first part of this chapter that we heard this morning in the text was the sower and the seed. Somebody goes out and plants seed. Jesus is paying attention to how the seed lands, what kind of soil it's in, and how does it grow, and how the season passes. And then he talks about the secret growth. You plant the seed, and the farmer looks, and it's got a sprout, and then he looks again, it's got a leaf, and then it's got a blade, and then now it's time to harvest. And they say, well, how'd that happen? I don't know how. It happened by itself.
But he does know what to do.
Well, he knows what to do. He knows it's time to plant, it's time to harvest, and water in between.
It's a mix of not knowing and yet deep knowing. They know what to do with that.
Yeah, but if you ask, well, how did that turn into that? I say, well, it knew. The plant knew. And then the third one was the parable of the mustard seed. And we were talking earlier about how the birds that come and land and find nests and everything in this thing that used to just be a little seed that they would have eaten. Just a little, they would have eaten that seed and it would have dropped out of them later. But as it is, it turned into this bush and it turned into nesting. And so those parables are everyday, ordinary observations. And yet somehow Jesus says, you see how that works? Now you go do it. He's like, well, I'm not a seed. I'm not going to sprout anything here. He said, no, I'm the vine. You're the branches. Like, no, I'm not. You see, he uses real life things like your teacher did. Look at it, get inside of it, see what it teaches you, and then take that with you in life. Great teaching. Any other pieces? Because we're right at the close of our time here. Any final
Brian
thoughts?
McLaren said a few things in something called reconciliation. And the basic idea is that rather than arguing from my strength to your weakness, practice this kind of surprising business. I will argue from my weakness to your strengths. It'll keep the conversation going, and you display a kind of curiosity, interest in the other person, and that. Otherwise, it just stops. If I'm listening to what to say, to argue, but if I'm displaying curiosity and interest, why you feel that way, and I'm willing to recognize that in some ways you have something I don't, and I'm weaker, that will keep it going. And I think that's Brian McLaren, and I just made that connection, thinking about it just when you asked that question. He taught me something about teaching.
And listening is perhaps one of the best ways of teaching.
That's what the curiosity part is.
Listening. And imagination falls in there too. So I want to mention the name of the book that we're talking about, We Make the Road by Walking. I like the fact there's dynamism in that. Is that it's not just a road, that I found the way or I'm on the way, but we're actually making the road as we're walking it. We're on this thing together. We don't know exactly where it's headed, but we trust that this process we're in, making the road, is going to get us to where we need to be. It's a faith issue. It's a faith trust. But I think it's an interesting dynamic for a title of a book.
It means that the journey is the goal, doesn't it? Isn't that kind of,
well, the journey is what we're in. And the goal is only going to be like, what direction are we going in? Will we go together? If we have different goals, we may end up splitting and going in different directions. But hopefully we're aiming for the same ecosystem of God, the same commonwealth economy, the same regenerative flourishing for the whole. And if we're on that path, we will make it. We will make the road as we walk it. And I think that's what we're doing here. Any last words? Gene?
Well, one thing I do want to add is that even though Jesus started off with common ordinary things like plants growing in a field and so on, and related to everyday people like that, I think he was challenging them to think about things that in a whole different kind of way. I mean, the story of the prodigal son, you know, it has such a shocking ending with the father embracing the lost son, even though the son, in a sense, had done some terrible things to him, humiliated him and so on. But he just embraces the son and welcomes him back, and it's just, some of his parables have these kind of shocking endings. Or the parable about the workers in the vineyard. They all work different hours, but the master ends up paying them all the same amount. That too has a shocking ending. He's trying to get us to think beyond the ordinary ways of how we think. You know, what's commensurate, and counting the cost and all these things. He's saying there's something else that's deeper and more important. And I think it's this economy of grace that
it challenges the way we see things in the status quo normally.
Yeah.
That allows us the freedom now to have a new thought, to think a second thought.
But that implies that there is an objective goodness out there, some kind of standard to which these other ways of doing it fall short. And he's saying, that standard is in you. And if I tell you the story, you can remember that truth.
And even a simple sentence like when Jesus says, remember, God has rain fall on the just and the unjust. The sun shines on the good and the evil. Like, that's not allowed in a really dualistic, bifurcated world. The evil is supposed to have bad things happen, good is supposed to happen here. But when it happens to all, that screeches to a halt, and so then we have to rethink things.
Yeah,
Even
that's
single
another
sentences.
example of just, you know.
And it's an observation of nature. It's just an observation. Look where the rain falls. You're not going to stop because that person's good and that person's bad.
Can I ask one?
Sure,
So,
sure.
where would you, in the 6 kinds of teaching that he did, where would you include this morning's communion? Is that a whole separate category?
No, I think he has that where he did production. He did dramatizations. He did acting out. And so when you break that bread, say, "This is my body,"
Okay.
and it's broken for you. Now eat it. I mean, it's drama. It's a dramatic reenacting of something that hadn't yet happened. And then he pours out the wine. And he says, he doesn't just say, "This is my blood for you." Da, 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 da. He says, "This is my blood shed for you, but for the forgiveness of your sin. It's the blood of the covenant poured out for you. And I'm not going to drink it with you again until we're in heaven together." Whoa. See, all that stuff is acted out, visceral stuff. Okay. Well, we thank you all for being with us here today. That's chapter 22.